Yes, there we go.
Okay, I was wondering about reviews of grant proposals.
We don't currently do reviews for grant proposals. We've focused on reviews for journal articles, but it is something we're working on.
Yeah, please go to the microphone.
Thank you for all the speakers. I think it has been extremely inspiring. And for me, I actually teach research integrity to graduates at my university. I'm going to take home a lot of inspiration. But what I found really striking was that last slide where you showed that actually the journals play a role in bringing up the quality. But then how do we live with the situation that among journals there's a high competition, and that if one journal starts to set up much stronger guidelines, they will most likely receive less of those sexy, easy results?
So the other point I could have made is that researchers themselves or research groups can enact the same change. So in my group, I'm now requiring my PhD students and postdocs to, run larger studies and use more stringency in their evaluation of the evidence. But it puts us at a disadvantage. Now, I can get away with that because, of course, I've got to a stage in my career where I can be a bit more kind of laissez-faire about things like publications. But for my PhD students and postdocs, it potentially puts them at a disadvantage. But the way that we have sort of framed that ourselves is that, first of all, when you look back on your career, do you want to look back on how many publications and your H-index, or do you want to say, actually, I found out a couple of things that really were true and moved the field forward? So it's about, at the early career stage, reframing people's expectations, because that's why people go into science. They don't go into science thinking, I'd like to publish loads of papers. And so what you do is badge it as quality. So yes, we may set the bar higher for ourselves, but by doing so, we make sure that what we produce is higher quality. And I think the same could be applied for journals. There was an interesting finding by Malcolm MacLeod, it's coming out in PLOS Biology, I think, showing, taking publications, animal studies from PubMed, from the institutions that submitted to the REF, the best institutions in the UK, and showing that on a variety of quality metrics, randomization, blinding, that kind of thing, that you can score these studies on. Studies from the best institutions in the UK scored worse than studies selected at random from PubMed, which supports the idea that the way to get a striking finding published in Nature is to do bad quality stuff.
Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that?
The only thing I'd add to that, very much in sympathy with those views, but you raise an important point that, it is a competitive market out there, it's a cruel world, it's often unfair, and if journals are sort of raising their standards, then that may put off some researchers. But I think we have to see this very much as a shared enterprise, so it's very important for the research community, for the funders, and for the publishers to, get together and be sort of discussing these sorts of things and come up with a joint framework about what it is that we want. And I think everybody has an interest in making sure that we do good research cost effectively, and there's nothing more wasteful than bad research that's done poorly and then everybody wastes our time publishing it.
Any other questions? Yeah, at the back. Rob.
Hi, Rob Johnson. It's partly a question for Andrew, but I'd also be interested in the thoughts of other panellists on the fact that we are starting to surface peer review, and clearly you mentioned a number of the positive implications of that in terms of credit. I guess there must be the risk of unintended consequences, perhaps incentivizing people in less positive ways. So is it about quantity rather than quality? Will people become more concerned that their findings will be out in the public domain and less inclined to be critical? So I'd just welcome any sort of thoughts on what the risks might be.
See you again, Rob. So it's something we're very cognizant of, and we look at it very closely. Our philosophy around the stuff is this is an area that's new and is going to evolve over time, and basically we intend to change things when and if they become necessary. We do now have a system where a better review in principle should get endorsed more. So if you do a high quality review, it shouldn't in principle be better for you and your reputation. But we don't. It hasn't been a critical thing for us up to this point, but it is something we monitor closely.
Michael?
Most of what we've heard about this morning has been really about evaluation based around journals, journal articles, and so on. What about evaluation of books?
Who wants to cover that?
Well, when I write a book, I'll tell you about it.
Yeah, I don't think so. In my case, I actually contributed to a number of book chapters. I think 2 or 3. I think it's very discipline dependent. I think from my perspective, it's actually rather curious, because what usually would happen is somebody says, "Oh, could you please write a part for a book chapter?" And then I wrote the part, and I never heard anything again. And then a few years later, I found out, oh, there's a book chapter somewhere. So I can only acknowledge the gap from my perspective. But I think this is a much more prominent item in other disciplines than, for example, the computational studies where I work.
I guess what that question reflects is the fact that we have a very kind of narrow view of what reflects, certainly in sort of biomedical sciences, my area, we have a very narrow view of what reflects an output that will be that will reflect on your profile, if you like, positively. So books tend to be very low down in that hierarchy. Journal articles much higher. That's obviously different in the humanities and so on, but I don't have direct experience of that. But I think it fits into that bigger question of, is the way that we do science up to date and fit for purpose? You know, journals are, 400 years old. Books are a bit older, going all the way back to Gutenberg and before. Do we need to move things on? Our statistical analysis techniques, many of them, the frequentist approach is 100 years out of date. So it's about whether we need to actually break out of these historical constraints.
We have time for one more question. All right, so I have one more question, so that's helpful. In fact, a lot of the talks portrayed a rather sort of depressing picture of where we are now in terms of evaluation. I just was curious about how optimistic you are about whether things will change in the future, or whether the things you've identified as failures will be addressed.
Well, yes, I think the situation is serious. The patient isn't actually critical, but isn't well. But actually, I am optimistic. I think, looking back over the last 5 years, the last 10 years, I think there have been enormous strides made. I think, many of the presentations and the innovations that we've seen presented just in the past couple of days have been enormously encouraging. I think funders are really sort of getting on board with this, and I think many publishers are also, stepping up to the mark. So, these are very interesting and positive times. Yes, this stuff is difficult, but I think all of us share the view that it's worth doing, and it's worth doing well.
So I agree, and actually I've been sort of banging on about this stuff for a while, and I've moved away from calling it a reproducibility crisis to an opportunity, and that was in one of my slides, because it is an opportunity to reflect on the way that we do things and bring things up to date. And there has been change in other fields. So in physics, for example, in the 50s they had a 3 sigma threshold for claiming discoveries, and they decided as a field that was just generating too much junk, and they moved towards the 5 sigma model that is now commonplace. And that was a cultural change from within the field, where they just decided as a group, let's work collaboratively, do stuff bigger, do less stuff, but make sure that it's right. We've seen a similar change recently in genomics, in the move from candidate gene studies to genome-wide association studies, large consortia, collaboration, hundreds of authors, but let's not worry about priority, let's worry about getting the right answer. Statistical stringency. I worked with a funder, CHDI Foundation, in the US, and the CEO, who is a lawyer and economist by training, used the analogy of the US automobile in the 70s. In the 70s, the US automobile industry was optimized for productivity, which I would argue is what science is currently optimized for. Just generate outputs, and let's not worry about if they're right, because the cars would come off the production line, some guy would count the wheels and check that the thing started, it would drive off, and it would break down a week later. The cars were built to be fixed later. That's what we have in science, this assumption that it will self-correct eventually and it's all going to be fine. Then the Japanese car industry brought in a statistician, Denning, who introduced the idea of quality control at every step of the production pipeline, making sure that this widget, which went into this bigger widget, was well manufactured and to a high quality. And they still, 40 years later, have a reputation for high quality production principles, just on the basis of those very small incremental changes in quality control at every step of the pipeline. And that's where I think open science fits in, because it enforces that quality control at the protocol stage by getting you to think about what analyses you're going to do, at the data collection stage by codifying the procedures, at the data analysis stage, and so on.
Yeah, I want to say something really simple, actually. Because when I started doing research in computer science, was already doing my bachelor project in the mid-2000s, what I faced was basically in the computational research, a lot of software projects, and people would engineer software and they would publish in conferences and nobody could read those papers because given institution only had access to a couple of conferences, and there were huge duplicate efforts in like grid infrastructure, for example, other software packages, a lot of redundant work. And I think that's something that really has changed over the last decade or so, that at least in my field, people are much more aware of each other's work. People try to do research that is adjacent rather than completely overlapping. People cite each other much more broadly. I think you can even see that in the impact factors of computer science journals, which are gradually starting to increase. So I think in my field it has changed a lot for the better already, that at least people are aware of each other's work. And of course there is still the problem of overselling and all the other complications about the quality of the research, but at least people are much more aware of each other's research, and I think that's a very important step forward. And I think as open access becomes more widespread and people happily upload their preprints as well, this will improve further. So I see that as a very positive development.
1 second.
A common theme that I've seen throughout all the talks and the questions was the trade-off between the short term and the long term. So a lot of metrics that we're operating with now are in the short term, and this is because it is hard to wait for the long term until we evaluate, where we actually have a better understanding of how the research was and how big the impact was, and measures that pertain to reputation as opposed to novelty. I think this is something common to not only publishing, and but here we are at a conference of open access, which is something new, and maybe we have been in a phase where everything is new, and we're discovering new things, and we're sort of trying out how to do it, and maybe now it's time to move on to more long-term thinking. So I'm curious how this will work out, and I'm curious about the future and looking forward to it.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to find out if Andrew's optimistic, but he looks straight. So we can take that for granted, right? All right, so thank you again to all of our speakers. It's now time for a coffee break, sponsored by MDPI.